At 7:41 p.m., Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, 1968, the jungle did not hear footsteps first. It heard music, electric guitar chords, sharp, distorted, unmistakably American, leaked through the trees, skipping across trunks, bouncing off leaves, carrying far beyond the perimeter tape. The song came from a field radio sitting on an ammo crate, volume turned just high enough to feel confident. Just loud enough to say, "We are here." Lieutenant Robert Miller, United States Army, 24 years old, West Point ring polished to a mirror shine, stood with one boot on a fallen log and surveyed the clearing like a parade ground. Sweat darkened his collar, but he did not wipe it away. He smoked slowly, deliberately, letting the sweet smell of imported cigarettes drift into the air. The ember glowed. The jungle took note. Around him his platoon moved loudly without realizing it. Tin cans clinked. Boots scuffed. Someone laughed. Someone cursed while opening a ration. An M16 bolt slammed home, unnecessarily. The clearing pulsed with human sound, rhythm, confidence. Miller smiled. He tapped the receiver of his M16, the black metal catching the last light of day. New rifle, new doctrine. Speed, volume, dominance. Firepower as language, noise as authority. Back in Texas, power meant presence. You made yourself known. You showed teeth so the other side thought twice. He glanced sideways at the men watching from the tree line. The Australians. They looked nothing like soldiers were supposed to look. Their uniforms were faded to a dull, uneven green, cloth softened by months of wear. Sleeves rolled without regulation, boots scuffed, laces mismatched. On their heads, those ridiculous floppy hats, brims bent and sweat-stained, crowns sagging like tired animals. They carried SLR rifles, heavy wooden-stocked things that looked like museum pieces compared to American plastic and aluminum. Miller exhaled smoke through his nose. "Jesus," he muttered to no one in particular. "You guys look like you crawled out of a swamp." Sergeant Jack didn't answer. Jack was older, late 30s, maybe 40. Hard to tell. Sun and jungle-aged men faster here. His face was lean, eyes pale and steady, jaw rough with stubble he didn't bother to shave. He stood with his rifle slung loose, weight settled into the ground as if he belonged to it. Jack had heard music like this before. He had heard it right before ambushes, right before screaming, right before the night came alive. He didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He simply turned his head slightly and spoke into his throat mic, voice barely louder than breath. "Pull back, 100 meters, same bearing." The Australians moved without discussion. No metal clinked. No branches snapped. Their boots rolled heel to toe, pressure controlled, each step placed where the jungle already wanted it. They spread out and disappeared, bodies breaking into shadow, then becoming shadow. In less than a minute they were gone, leaving behind no smell of soap, no smoke, no noise but insects returning to normal. Miller watched them go and laughed once. "See that?" he said to his platoon. "They're scared. That's what scared looks like." He waved a hand. "Keep the radio on. Let Charlie know who owns the night." The sun dropped fast, as it always did. Light drained out of the forest like blood from a wound. The sky turned purple, then black. Fireflies blinked. The humidity thickened. Sweat ran freely now, soaked into uniforms washed that morning with perfumed soap flown in from base. The music kept playing. From 100 meters away, Sergeant Jack lay flat, cheek against damp earth, eyes open and still. He smelled rot, soil, old rain. The jungle spoke softly to him. Small movements, insects shifting, distant frogs. And beneath it all, carried on the night air like a signal flare, American noise. Jack didn't look at the camp. He looked past it. He watched the darkness where darkness did not quite belong. At 7:58 p.m., something answered the music. A sharp thump cut through the song, low, hollow, unmistakable to anyone who had lived long enough in this place. A B-40 rocket left its tube. The night lit up. The rocket struck the clearing's edge and exploded into a flat, concussive roar that slapped the air out of lungs. Dirt and splinters rained down. The radio flipped onto its side, music cutting mid-note as if strangled. For half a second there was silence. Then the night opened its mouth. Another thump. Another B-40. This one overshot, detonating behind the American perimeter, showering the camp with fragments that sounded like handfuls of nails hurled at metal. A third followed, closer, too close. A crate of rations burst apart, tins spinning, steam hissing as hot metal met jungle damp. Someone screamed, "Contact! Contact!" Miller spun toward the darkness, heart punching at his ribs. He raised his M16 and fired without aiming. Muzzle flash strobing white, lighting up trees that offered no targets. Around him, the platoon followed suit. Rifles cracked in a ragged chorus, brass casings spraying onto the ground, piling up like golden leaves. The jungle swallowed the noise and gave nothing back. No silhouettes, no return fire, just the distant cough of another launcher being reloaded somewhere unseen. Miller grabbed the radio, hands slick with sweat. "Red 1, this is Red 1 Actual, taking rocket fire, grid unknown, request immediate fire support, danger close." His voice climbed as he spoke, words tumbling over each other. He couldn't see. That was the problem. Power meant nothing when there was nothing to point it at. The enemy fired again. This time, the B-40 slammed into the outer ring of sandbags, blasting one apart and throwing a soldier backward. He hit the ground hard, helmet rolling off, eyes wide, breath gone. Someone dragged him away as rounds continued to snap into the trees. The Americans fired harder. Miller ordered illumination rounds. Flares hissed upward, bloomed and drifted down, bathing the clearing in harsh white light. For a moment the jungle stood naked, trees frozen, leaves glowing, shadows sharp as knives. Still no enemy. The flares died. Darkness surged back in like water filling a hole. Miller's breathing was loud in his ears. He wiped his face with his sleeve, smearing dirt and sweat together. "Where the hell are they?" he shouted. 100 meters away, Sergeant Jack lay motionless. He had not fired a single round. He watched the flashes. The B-40 launchers betrayed themselves for fractions of a second. Brief cones of orange light, low to the ground, always from the same general arc. The enemy was disciplined. They fired, shifted slightly, waited. They were not charging. They were testing, provoking panic, letting noise do the work. Jack raised 2 fingers. His men adjusted positions by inches, slow and deliberate. One Australian slid a notebook from his chest pocket and marked angles by touch, not light. Another eased a mortar tube into position, patting its base with folded cloth so it wouldn't bite into rock and ring. Jack whispered into the mic. "Enemy rockets, bearing 230, range, estimate 150, confirmed by flash." They waited. Another B-40 fired. Jack saw it. There, just there. A tongue of flame, then gone. He nodded once. Confirmed. He did not call artillery. Not yet. Artillery was loud. Artillery announced itself. Artillery was for when you wanted the jungle to know you were angry. Jack wanted the jungle to stay quiet. He adjusted the mortar by degrees, not numbers. He did it by memory. How sound carried here. How the ground rose slightly in that direction. How men liked to set up launchers with a tree at their back and an escape route to the side. In the American camp, Miller's world was shrinking. Every sound was a threat. Every shadow a possible muzzle. His men were burning through ammunition, magazines emptied and slammed home again, hands shaking as muscle memory fought panic. Thousands of rounds cut into leaves and bark, shredding foliage, accomplishing nothing. "Cease fire!" Miller shouted. No one heard him. Another rocket came in, exploding short, spraying fragments that rattled against helmets and rifles. A corporal went down clutching his leg, blood dark and sudden. Miller screamed into the radio again. "Fire mission, now!" Coordinates were shouted, guessed, corrected, shouted again. The grid was rough, approximate, born from fear and bad angles. The artillery battery acknowledged. Tubes swung miles away. Jack heard the distant whump of American guns beginning their work. He grimaced. "Too wide," he murmured. "They'll spook and slip." He leaned closer to the mortarman. "1 round," he said, "that's all." The Australian adjusted elevation with the edge of his boot. Slow, careful. No rushing. No counting down out loud. Just breath, pressure, feel. Jack raised his fist. The Americans were still firing when the mortar dropped. It made no sound at first, just a soft thunk, almost polite. Then, somewhere in the darkness, the jungle folded inward on itself. The explosion was smaller than artillery. Sharper, precise. A single violent punctuation mark. The B-40 fire stopped. Not paused. Stopped. Jack listened. Nothing. No shouting, no movement, no scrambling retreat. Just the insects, confused for a moment, then resuming their chorus. He exhaled slowly. In the clearing, American rifles continued to bark for several more seconds before Miller finally got them under control. Smoke hung low. Spent casings carpeted the ground. Men panted, eyes wild, scanning shadows that no longer held anything hostile. The artillery landed late, thunderous and blind, tearing into empty forest. Jack didn't watch it. He was already moving forward. Jack moved first, but he did not hurry. He rose only enough to let blood return to his legs, then slid forward, low and narrow, rifle carried loose, muzzle down. His men followed at measured intervals, never in a straight line, never silhouetted. The jungle accepted them back like they had never left. Behind them, the American artillery finished tearing up nothing. The forest shook under the weight of misplaced power. Trees splintered, earth geysered. Shockwaves rolled outward, loud enough to satisfy fear but useless against an enemy already gone, or dead. Jack counted steps in his head, not time. He remembered another jungle, another year. 1966. Same province, different clearing. Back then, Jack had been the junior man. The one watching older soldiers move like ghosts, learning without being taught. He remembered how his first patrol commander had stopped them 3 kilometers short of a suspected enemy camp and made them wait in silence for hours. Jack had thought it was madness, until he noticed it. The jungle had patterns. When humans disturbed it loudly, everything fled at once. When humans disturbed it softly, things moved in layers. Birds first, then insects, then rats, then men. Power, his commander had told him later, wasn't volume. Power was control of reaction. Jack had carried that lesson into every operation since. Ahead, the faint smell of cordite confirmed what his eyes already knew. The mortar had been perfect. Too perfect for anyone nearby to survive and crawl away. He signaled halt. One Australian peeled off to check the impact site while the others stayed frozen. Jack waited, counting breaths. If the enemy had friends, this was when they would rush in, loud and angry, firing blind. Nothing came. The scout returned, nodding once. Launcher crew neutralized. No celebration, no comment. They withdrew the same way they had come, erasing themselves from the ground. Back in the clearing, Lieutenant Miller stood under a hanging flare stub that still smoked faintly, its white light staining everything it touched. His ears rang. His throat was dry. He realized his cigarette had burned down to the filter between his fingers without him noticing. The camp looked like a storm had passed through. Sandbags ripped open, ration tins scattered, trees shredded, and everywhere, brass. Thousands of shell casings glittered dully in the dirt, catching the light like a mockery of effort. The wounded were being tended to. The dead, 2 of them, lay under ponchos near the edge of the clearing, faces covered, boots still visible. Miller stared at those boots longer than he meant to. The radio crackled, artillery asking for confirmation of effect. Miller swallowed. "Negative," he said. "Stand down." Silence followed. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He had done everything right. By the book. Dominance. Fire superiority. Immediate response. He had shown the enemy strength, and yet he felt smaller now than he had an hour ago. He looked toward the tree line. That was when he noticed the Australians returning. They came in from the darkness as if assembled from it, quiet shapes resolving into men. Their uniforms were darker now, damp with dew and sweat that smelled like earth, not soap. Their rifles were clean, their faces unreadable. Jack walked at the front. Miller straightened instinctively, suddenly aware of his posture, his rank, his authority. He took a step forward, then stopped when Jack stopped. Jack didn't salute. Not disrespectfully, just naturally. The jungle didn't care about salutes. "You good?" Jack asked. Miller hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," he said. "We took contact, heavy." Jack looked past him, eyes drifting to the churned ground, the shredded trees, the crater lines cutting into nothing useful. His gaze lingered on the shell casings. "How many rockets?" Jack asked. 3, maybe 4. Jack nodded slowly. "And after?" "They stopped," Miller said, defensive edge creeping into his voice. "We drove them off." Jack didn't argue. He turned slightly and pointed, not dramatically, just enough to guide attention, to a spot beyond the perimeter. A single crater, neat and sharp-edged, sat there like a signature. One impact, one solution. "That was ours," Jack said. Miller followed the line of sight, confusion knitting his brow. "One round?" he asked. Jack shrugged. Didn't need more. Miller felt heat rise in his chest. Not anger, not exactly. Something worse. Displacement. The sense that the ground rules had shifted without him being told. He gestured around. We laid down suppressive fire, he said. Called Artie. Standard procedure. Jack finally looked at him directly. And now they know exactly where you are, he said calmly. How many you've got. What you're scared of. Miller opened his mouth, then closed it. Jack stepped closer, close enough that Miller could smell him. Mud, metal, sweat, old canvas. Back home, Jack said, voice low, almost conversational. Noise scares things away. He tapped the trunk of a nearby tree with 2 fingers. Out here, noise invites company. He paused, then added almost gently, Here, if you want to make a fuss, you'll be easy prey. He clapped Miller once on the shoulder, not hard. We'd rather be Black Panthers. Jack turned and walked back into the jungle, his men following, already dissolving into shadow. Miller stood alone in the clearing, the music radio crushed under a boot. The night suddenly very quiet. Miller didn't sleep. The jungle cooled just before dawn, a thin mist clinging to the ground like breath held too long. The clearing smelled burned now, powder, sap, scorched earth. Every sound felt closer in daylight's absence, every rustle heavier with meaning. Miller sat on an ammo crate, helmet off, fingers locked together, staring at the place where Jack had disappeared. Black Panthers. The phrase gnawed at him. He had grown up believing war was momentum. Texas football, Texas roads, Texas confidence. You hit first. You hit loud. You let the other side know they were already beaten. West Point had sharpened that belief, polished it into doctrine. Firepower, mobility, shock. Control the tempo and the enemy collapses. But tonight the enemy hadn't collapsed. They had waited. Miller replayed the moment in his head. The first rocket. The blindness. The fear that came not from death, but from uncertainty. From not knowing where to point the gun. He hated that feeling. Jack slept lightly even after the contact. Not because he wasn't tired, but because rest in his world was conditional. He lay with his back against a tree, hat pulled low, listening. He had trained himself to wake at the wrong sound, not the loud one. Loud noises were usually already too late. As the light crept in, his mind drifted, not to last night, but to an older memory. Malaya, early 1950s. Different war, same jungle. Jack had been a boy then, barely old enough to shave, following men who had learned jungle fighting from the British the hard way, through mistakes, ambushes, funerals. Back then, radios were unreliable, maps useless after the first rain. Everything came down to eyes, ears, patience. He remembered his first kill. Not the act, but the lesson. The man had been close. Too close. Jack had been shaking, fingers stiff on the trigger, breath ragged. He'd wanted it over fast, loud, decisive. But the patrol commander had touched his arm and whispered, "Wait." They had waited 5 minutes. In that time, 3 more enemy soldiers had stepped into view, careless, confident, convinced the jungle was empty. One burst, 4 bodies. Jack learned then that silence multiplied force. That lesson never left him. At first light, the joint patrol reformed. Miller stood straighter now. Less swagger, more focus. His men noticed the difference even if they didn't name it. He issued orders with fewer words. He turned the radio off. No music. They moved out together. Americans forward, Australians offset, maintaining distance. Jack had insisted on it again. This time, Miller hadn't argued. The jungle revealed what the night had hidden. At the mortar impact site, the reality was stark. The launcher lay twisted, half buried. 2 bodies nearby, motionless, faces turned into the dirt. No dramatic devastation. Just finality. Miller stared longer than necessary. 1 round. He thought of the thousands his platoon had fired. The effort, the exhaustion, the empty noise. Jack crouched, examined tracks around the site. He didn't need long. 3-man team, he said quietly. 1 launcher. They thought you'd panic. Miller nodded, ashamed that they had been right. They moved on. As the hours passed, Miller noticed things he hadn't before. The Australians never stepped on dead leaves if they could avoid it. They paused before crossing open ground, not because of fear, but calculation. When they drank, they wiped their mouths. When they rested, they faced outward. They smelled different. Not clean, not dirty. Neutral. Miller caught himself adjusting his own movements, lowering his foot more carefully, slowing his breathing, resisting the urge to fidget. It felt unnatural, like trying to think in a new language. Midday heat pressed down. Sweat soaked through uniforms. A distant helicopter thumped somewhere beyond the canopy. then faded. They halted near a narrow trail, barely visible unless you knew how to look. Jack raised a fist. Everyone froze. Minutes passed. Miller's legs began to ache. His mind started to wander. Is this necessary? Are we wasting time? The urge to move, to do something, scratched at him. Then he saw it. A leaf trembled, not from wind, but pressure. Jack saw it too. No one fired. They waited. A figure eased into view on the trail, then another. North Vietnamese regulars this time, not local guerrillas. Rifles slung, moving cautiously, but not cautiously enough. Miller felt the familiar surge, now. Jack's hand stayed raised. A third man appeared, then a fourth. Jack lowered his hand. 2 suppressed shots cracked softly. 2 men fell before sound fully registered. The other 2 froze. Too late. Australians flowed forward, rifles barking once more. 4 enemies, 4 rounds. Over in seconds. Miller stood still, heart hammering, stunned by how quiet death could be. Jack turned to him. You see? He asked. Miller nodded slowly. Jack didn't smile. This jungle, he said, doesn't reward confidence. It rewards attention. Miller looked down at his M16, then back at the men who had done more with less, again. For the first time since arriving in Phuoc Tuy, he felt something shift, not in the jungle, but in himself. The idea that power could be invisible. And that survival belonged to those who let the enemy make the first mistake and the last sound. The silence after the contact lingered longer than the gunfire itself. 4 bodies lay on the trail, steam rising faintly where blood met warm earth. No one spoke. The jungle resumed its noise cautiously, as if testing whether it was safe to exist again. Miller exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, the way Jack had done the night before. He realized his hands weren't shaking. That unsettled him more than fear ever had. Jack knelt by the fallen men, checking for signs of movement with the tip of his boot. Satisfied, he straightened and scanned the canopy, then the ground, then the space in between. His eyes never stopped working. Clock's ticking now, Jack said quietly. Miller frowned. Because of this? Jack nodded once. They were moving to confirm last night. They won't come again in 4s. As if on cue, the jungle shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously. Just wrong. Birds went silent first, not all at once. Patches of quiet spreading outward like oil on water. Insects followed, their constant hum thinning until it felt hollow. Jack felt it in his spine. He raised his fist again. This time Miller reacted instantly. The Americans halted, dropped, turned outward without being told. No clatter, no curses. Training adapting in real time. Jack noticed. So did the jungle. Minutes passed. Sweat rolled down faces. Ants crawled over knuckles and wrists, ignored. The air thickened with anticipation. Every breath measured. Jack's mind ran calculations without numbers. They know where the Americans are. They don't know where we are. They'll try to pull fire. Make noise answer noise. He leaned close to Miller. Next contact won't start with rockets, he murmured. It'll start with 1 shot. They'll want you loud again. Miller swallowed. And if we don't give it to them? Jack's eyes flicked to the trees. Then they'll make it personal. The first shot came from the left. A single crack. Sharp, precise. A bullet snapped past Miller's shoulder and punched into a tree behind him. Bark exploding outward. No one screamed. No one fired back. Miller felt the old instinct surge. Return fire, suppress, dominate. He didn't move. Jack raised 2 fingers, then pointed. Right flank, low. The Australians melted away from the American formation, slipping into positions already chosen, already known. Miller watched, heart pounding, forcing himself to stay still. Another shot rang out, this one closer. A soldier flinched. Jack's fist tightened. Hold, he whispered. The jungle held its breath. The enemy shooter fired again, frustration creeping into the rhythm now. 3 shots, 3 positions revealed by sound, not sight. Jack nodded. The counterstroke was brief. A suppressed rifle coughed once, then again, then silence. No shout, no death cry. The shooter never knew where it came from. Miller realized something then, cold and absolute. If Jack hadn't been here, he would have ordered fire. His men would have lit up the jungle. The enemy would have circled, closed, punished the noise, and they would have died tired and confused, surrounded by empty shell casings. The jungle stayed quiet. Jack waited another full minute before lowering his hand. That's one, he said. They'll test again. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, it came. Not as gunfire, but movement. A shape darting between trees. Another following. Too fast to be patrol. too deliberate to be animals. Jack crouched, eyes narrowing. "Probe," he said. "They're looking for panic." Miller leaned in. "What do we do?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He studied the ground, the light, the slope of the land. He listened, not just for sound, but for intention. Then he said it. "We do nothing." Miller stared at him. "Nothing?" Jack nodded. "Nothing that makes noise." The shapes moved closer, emboldened by the lack of response. They crept, stopped, whispered. They were good, disciplined, patient. They had learned that Americans reacted. They were about to learn something else. Jack tapped two men forward, one Australian, one American. The American was young, barely 20, eyes wide but focused. Miller caught his glance and gave a slight nod. No words. They crawled inch by inch, becoming part of the ground. The enemy never noticed. When it ended like a switch being flipped. Two bodies dropped silently. A third tried to run and made it 3 steps. The jungle swallowed him. The remaining movement vanished, not retreating loudly but dissolving, uncertain now. Jack stood slowly. "That'll buy us a day," he said. Miller felt something heavy settle in his chest. Not fear, not pride. Respect. They moved again before the jungle could change its mind. As afternoon light slanted through the trees, Miller walked closer to Jack than before. "You ever get scared?" he asked quietly. Jack didn't look at him. "All the time," he said. "That's how I know when to stay quiet." Miller nodded. For the first time, he understood the paradox. Power wasn't the ability to force the jungle to react. Power was denying it the reaction it wanted. And in that denial, surviving. The jungle watched them go, frustrated, confused, its prey no longer announcing itself. They halted before dusk, not because they were tired, but because the light was turning unreliable. In Phuoc Tuy, dusk wasn't an ending, it was a hinge. Jack chose the halt site without consulting a map. A shallow rise, good drainage, broken canopy above, enough to scatter moonlight without outlining silhouettes. Approaches limited to 2 natural corridors, both easily watched. He raised his hand once. Everyone stopped. No one asked why. The Australians flowed into position first, instinctive, silent. The Americans followed, copying without fully understanding, learning by doing. Packs came off carefully. Rifles were laid down, muzzles oriented. Claymore mines stayed packed. Too loud, too final. Jack moved among them, correcting by touch. A knee nudged here, a barrel lowered there. He didn't speak unless necessary. Miller watched closely. This wasn't preparation for a fight. This was preparation for waiting. Jack crouched beside Miller. "They'll come back tonight," he said. Not a guess, a statement. Miller nodded. "Same play?" Jack shook his head slightly. "They won't repeat mistakes. They know rockets won't scare you now. What will they try?" Jack looked at the Americans' perimeter, then at the Australians' offset positions. "They'll use you," he said. "They'll try to make you loud again." Miller grimaced. "Fake contact. Or a wounded man," Jack added. "Or a runner. Or nothing at all." Miller absorbed that. "What's the plan?" he asked. Jack paused, then spoke carefully. "We don't win tonight by killing them," he said. "We win by teaching them we're not worth the effort." That idea ran against everything Miller had been taught. Jack continued. "They want confirmation, proof. They want to know where you end and where we begin. If they don't get that, they'll pull back and look elsewhere." Miller frowned. "So, no fire?" "Only if it's clean," Jack said. "Only if it's final." Jack pointed at the Americans' radios. "No transmissions after dark unless I say. No flares, no music, no smoking." Miller flushed slightly but nodded. Jack's voice dropped further. "And if someone gets hit, we don't rush." That landed hard. Miller stiffened. "You're saying leave them?" "I'm saying don't let them bait you into losing more," Jack replied evenly. "Extraction only when we control the space." Silence followed. The Americans exchanged glances. This was new ground. Uncomfortable ground. Miller took a breath. "Understood," he said. "I'll enforce it." Jack studied him for a second longer than necessary, then nodded once. "Good." Night settled in layers. First the light went, then depth perception, then certainty. Men lay prone, faces inches from dirt, watching nothing, listening to everything. Sweat cooled on skin, muscles cramped and relaxed again. Time stretched. At 2014, something moved at the edge of perception. Not sound, absence. Jack felt it immediately. He didn't signal. He waited. At 2021, a shape appeared between trees. Slow, deliberate. A single figure, upright, hands visible. Vietnamese army uniform. No weapon raised. He stopped just short of the American's outer line. "American!" the man called, voice carrying carefully. "I surrender." Miller felt his stomach tighten. This was textbook. The man took a step forward. "I am wounded," he said. "I need help." The urge hit like a punch. Miller's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed act. Help. Capture. Control. Jack didn't move. The man waited. No response. He took another step. Jack lifted one finger. Two Australians adjusted their aim. The man's breathing changed. Jack saw it. The hesitation. The calculation. He dropped his hand suddenly and ran. Jack's finger dropped with him. One suppressed shot. The runner fell hard, skidding across leaves, motionless. No follow-up fire came. The jungle stayed quiet. Jack didn't relax. He watched the dark for another full minute. Nothing. At 20:37, another sound, soft crying, farther off. A different voice, higher pitch. Miller closed his eyes. Jack leaned in close. "They're testing your humanity," he whispered. "Don't give it to them for free." The crying faded. Minutes passed. Then an hour. No attack came. By midnight, even the jungle seemed to accept defeat. Jack finally shifted position. "That's it," he said quietly. "They won't push tonight." Miller exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath for longer than he knew. They stayed until dawn anyway, because victory here wasn't about what happened. It was about what didn't. When the sky lightened and birds returned in earnest, Jack stood and stretched, joints cracking softly. Miller rose beside him. "No one fired," Miller said, almost incredulous. Jack nodded. "That's why we won." Miller looked out at the untouched forest. No craters, no smoke, no shell casings, just silence that felt earned. He understood now. Firepower could clear space, but restraint controlled time. And in this war, time decided who went home. Dawn did not arrive all at once. It seeped in. Gray first, then a pale green wash as the canopy thinned into shapes instead of walls. Moisture lifted from the ground in slow curls. The jungle exhaled. No one moved. Jack kept them still for another 10 minutes after full light, long enough for impatience to become uncomfortable. Long enough for any watching eyes to reveal themselves by mistake. Nothing did. Only then did he give the signal to rise. The men stood carefully, muscles stiff, fingers numb, senses sharpened by a night of denial. Faces looked older in daylight, quieter, like something had been scraped away. Miller rolled his shoulders and realized he felt calm. That unsettled him. He walked the perimeter with Jack, step for step, not speaking. They read the ground together, tracks, broken stems, a smear of blood leading nowhere, signs of hesitation rather than retreat. "They pulled back clean," Miller said finally. Jack nodded. "Which means they'll come back smarter." "When?" Jack stopped. He knelt, brushed aside leaves with 2 fingers, studied an imprint most men would miss entirely. "Soon," he said. "Not loud, not fast." Miller checked his watch. So 6:48. The clock had started again. "They didn't move camp." Jack decided that. "They expect you to relocate," he said. "So we won't." Miller hesitated. "That's risky." Jack looked at him. "Everything here is risky. The trick is choosing the risk they didn't plan for." The joint force reset quietly. No breakfast fires. Cold rations eaten slowly. Water sipped, not gulped. Radios stayed dark. By 07:22, the jungle had fully woken. That's when Jack felt it, the pressure behind the eyes, the sensation of being watched without seeing the watcher. He raised 2 fingers. 2 contacts, at least. The Australians shifted by centimeters. Americans mirrored them. The line blurred. Minutes passed. Then, a branch snapped, not close, not far. A deliberate sound. Jack didn't react. Another snap, different direction. Miller counted his breaths. In, out. A third sound, soft, human. Jack whispered, "They're walking you." The tactic was old. Move just enough to make men track shadows. Force heads to turn. Break stillness into motion. At 07:31, a rifle cracked. A single shot. It hit dirt between 2 Americans, spraying soil into faces. A warning, an invitation. No one fired back. Jack felt respect for the enemy rise slightly. They were good. Controlled. He also felt the tension spike. The shooter fired again, closer this time. A round clipped a backpack, tearing fabric. Miller's jaw clenched. Jack leaned close. "They want you to answer," he said. "If you do, they'll fix you." Another shot. This one hit. A soldier cried out, dropping to one knee, clutching his arm. Blood spread fast. Time slowed. Every instinct screamed. Miller looked at Jack. Jack's eyes were hard, focused, not cruel. "Wait," he said. The wounded man gasped, trying to stay quiet, teeth clenched. A medic crawled to him without being told. Movement slow, careful. No return fire. The enemy shooter hesitated. Jack saw it. The pause meant uncertainty. At 07:36, Jack raised his hand. Two Australians flanked wide, invisible. Miller watched the wounded soldier, then the trees, then Jack. The jungle held its breath. The enemy fired again, angrier now. Closer still. Jack dropped his hand. The response was surgical. 3 suppressed shots from 3 angles. The enemy never had time to understand what went wrong. Silence followed, thick, heavy. Jack waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Then, movement, fast, multiple. Jack whispered, "That's the reaction force." This was the real test. They came low and quick, using terrain, confident now that contact had been made. This was the moment Miller would have called artillery before. Jack shook his head slightly. "Let them come," he said. Miller swallowed hard. The countdown compressed. 07:39, 07:40. Figures appeared between trunks. 5, 6. Jack let them close. Too close. Then he moved. It wasn't an order. It was permission. The Australians struck first, short, controlled bursts. Americans followed, not louder, not faster, just enough. The firefight lasted under 90 seconds. No yelling, no chaos, no wasted rounds. When it ended, the jungle went quiet in that final way, when even fear has left. Bodies lay where momentum had failed them. The wounded American was alive, pale, breathing. Jack knelt beside him. "You're good," he said simply. Miller stood, chest heaving, adrenaline shaking through him like cold. He looked at his watch again. 7:43. 12 minutes. That was all it had taken. Jack rose and surveyed the ground. "They'll remember this," he said. "Not because we killed them." Miller looked at the fallen enemy. "Then why?" Jack met his eyes. "Because they never controlled the moment." Miller nodded slowly. He understood now what Jack meant by Black Panthers. Not invisible, unpredictable. They moved out before helicopters arrived, before reports were filed, before anyone could turn the event into a statistic. The jungle closed behind them. It did not pursue. They did not celebrate. That was the first thing Miller noticed as the echo of gunfire drained out of the forest. No whoops, no release, just a collective return to stillness, as if the jungle itself demanded a receipt for every sound made. Jack moved through the aftermath methodically. Weapons safe, perimeter checked, eyes outward. The wounded American sat against a tree, sleeve cut away, medic working fast and quiet. Blood loss controlled, shock kept at bay. He clenched his jaw, eyes fixed on nothing, doing his part by staying silent. Jack knelt beside him. "You did well," he said, not kindly, not harshly, just factual. The soldier nodded, breathing shallow. Jack stood and moved on. Bodies were searched quickly, respectfully, papers taken, weapons checked, then left. No trophies, no photographs, no proof beyond memory. Miller followed Jack, trying to understand how quickly order returned after violence when no one chased adrenaline. "This is it?" Miller asked under his breath. "We just leave?" Jack paused, listening. "After action comes later," he said. "Right now we vanish." They broke contact with the ground like a thought slipping away. The Australians went first again, dissolving into depth. Americans followed, keeping spacing, watching arcs. Miller felt the strange discipline of moving without feeling like movement mattered. No urgency, no fear, just intent. They walked for 40 minutes without speaking. Only then did Jack halt them near a dry creek bed choked with roots and shadow. The place felt old, quiet, forgotten. Jack allowed the men to sit. Not slump, sit. The wounded man was stabilized. The medic finally let his shoulders drop. Miller exhaled slowly and realized his chest hurt, not from exertion but restraint. Jack gathered the Americans and Australians together, not in a tight huddle, but close enough to share air. "No talk about what happened," he said. "Not yet. Not on radio, not on paper. You'll forget details if you rush it." Miller nodded. Jack continued, voice low. "We count what matters." He held up one finger. One wounded, alive. A second finger. No pursuit. A third. "They broke contact on our terms." He lowered his hand. "That's success." Miller waited, then asked the question he couldn't avoid. "What about them?" Jack didn't look away. "They chose the time. We chose the end." Silence accepted that. Later, when helicopters finally thumped into range, late as always, Jack waved them off with a simple hand signal. Not needed. Not now. Extraction would come when the jungle forgot again. Miller found himself sitting beside Jack, backs against the same tree. "Back home," Miller said quietly. "This would have been written up as a firefight. Kill counts. ammunition expended. Jack nodded. That's for people who weren't there. Miller rubbed his hands together, still feeling the phantom urge to act. I almost broke it, he admitted, when my man went down. Jack looked at him then. So did I, he said, every time. That surprised Miller. Jack continued. Discipline isn't not feeling it. It's deciding who gets to feel it. The words settled like weight. They rested another hour, then moved again, careful to break patterns, double back once, then not again. By early afternoon, they were ghosts. The jungle closed. That night, back at a forward position miles away, Miller sat alone with his notebook. He didn't write. He stared at the page, pen hovering, unsure what language applied. He thought of the shell casings from the first night. Thousands of them, glittering and useless. He thought of the single mortar round that ended the rockets, the 4 suppressed shots on the trail, the 12 minutes that decided the morning. He realized something uncomfortable. He had believed leadership meant certainty. Jack had shown him it meant tolerance for uncertainty, without trying to erase it with noise. A runner arrived with coffee, burnt thin. Miller took it and drank slowly. Outside, soldiers laughed softly. Not relief, just normalcy returning. Jack passed by without stopping. Miller called out, "Sergeant!" Jack paused. Miller stood. "Thank you." Jack studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Next time," he said, "you'll hear it sooner." "Hear what?" Jack tapped the side of his head. "The jungle deciding." He walked on. Miller sat back down, coffee cooling in his hands. For the first time since arriving in Vietnam, he did not feel the need to prove anything to the forest. He felt the need to listen. The night came quietly, and for once nothing answered it. They did not celebrate. That was the first thing Miller noticed as the echo of gunfire drained out of the forest. No whoops, no release. Just a collective return to stillness, as if the jungle itself demanded a receipt for every sound made. Jack moved through the aftermath methodically. Weapons safe, perimeter checked, eyes outward. The wounded American sat against a tree, sleeve cut away, medic working fast and quiet. Blood loss controlled. Shock kept at bay. He clenched his jaw, eyes fixed on nothing, doing his part by staying silent. Jack knelt beside him. "You did well," he said, not kindly, not harshly, just factual. The soldier nodded, breathing shallow. Jack stood and moved on. Bodies were searched quickly, respectfully. Papers taken. Weapons checked, then left. No trophies. No photographs. No proof beyond memory. Miller followed Jack, trying to understand how quickly order returned after violence when no one chased adrenaline. "This is it?" Miller asked under his breath. We just leave?" Jack paused, listening. "After action comes later," he said. "Right now we vanish." They broke contact with the ground like a thought slipping away. The Australians went first again, dissolving into depth. Americans followed, keeping spacing, watching arcs. Miller felt the strange discipline of moving without feeling like movement mattered. No urgency, no fear, just intent. They walked for 40 minutes without speaking. Only then did Jack halt them near a dry creek bed choked with roots and shadow. The place felt old, quiet, forgotten. Jack allowed the men to sit, not slump, sit. The wounded man was stabilized. The medic finally let his shoulders drop. Miller exhaled slowly and realized his chest hurt, not from exertion, but restraint. Jack gathered the Americans and Australians together, not in a tight huddle, but close enough to share air. "No talk about what happened," he said. "Not yet, not on radio, not on paper. You'll forget details if you rush it." Miller nodded. Jack continued, voice low. "We count what matters." He held up one finger. One wounded, alive. A second finger. No pursuit. A third. "They broke contact on our terms." He lowered his hand. "That's success." Miller waited, then asked the question he couldn't avoid. "What about them?" Jack didn't look away. "They chose the time. We chose the end." Silence accepted that. Later, when helicopters finally thumped into range, late, as always, Jack waved them off with a simple hand signal. Not needed, not now. Extraction would come when the jungle forgot again. Miller found himself sitting beside Jack, backs against the same tree. "Back home," Miller said quietly, "this would have been written up as a firefight. Kill counts, ammunition expended." Jack nodded. "That's for people who weren't there." Miller rubbed his hands together, still feeling the phantom urge to act. "I almost broke it," he admitted, "when my man went down." Jack looked at him then. "So did I," he said, "every time." That surprised Miller. Jack continued. "Discipline isn't not feeling it. It's deciding who gets to feel it." The words settled like weight. They rested another hour, then moved again, careful to break patterns, double back once, then not again. By early afternoon, they were ghosts. The jungle closed. That night, back at a forward position miles away, Miller sat alone with his notebook. He didn't write. He stared at the page, pen hovering, unsure what language applied. He thought of the shell casings from the first night. Thousands of them, glittering and useless. He thought of the single mortar round that ended the rockets. The 4 suppressed shots on the trail. The 12 minutes that decided the morning. He realized something uncomfortable. He had believed leadership meant certainty. Jack had shown him it meant tolerance for uncertainty, without trying to erase it with noise. A runner arrived with coffee, burnt, thin. Miller took it and drank slowly. Outside, soldiers laughed softly. Not relief, just normalcy returning. Jack passed by without stopping. Miller called out, "Sergeant!" Jack paused. Miller stood. "Thank you." Jack studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Next time," he said, "you'll hear it sooner." "Hear what?" Jack tapped the side of his head. The jungle deciding. He walked on. Miller sat back down, coffee cooling in his hands. For the first time since arriving in Vietnam, he did not feel the need to prove anything to the forest. He felt the need to listen. The night came quietly, and for once nothing answered it. Years later, the official records would barely mention the operation. No name, no citation, no neat box in an archive labeled Joint Success. Just a line in a battalion log, enemy contact avoided, minimal casualties. That was how the jungle liked it. But stories don't live in logs. They live in men. The first time Miller returned to Vietnam after the war, decades later, older, slower, hair gone gray, he did not go looking for battlefields. He went looking for trees. Phuoc Tuy had changed. Roads cut through places that once swallowed platoons whole. Villages sat where patrols had waited in silence. Children laughed where men had bled quietly into leaves. But the jungle was still there, older, thinner, watching. Miller stood at the edge of a forest trail, tourist map folded uselessly in his pocket. Cicadas screamed. The air pressed in familiar ways. He closed his eyes. And for a moment he was 24 again, standing in a clearing filled with music. Then another memory replaced it, clearer, stronger. Jack's hand raised. The waiting. The decision not to answer noise with noise. Miller opened his eyes. He smiled once faintly. Jack never wrote memoirs. Men like him rarely did. He returned to Australia after his service, melted back into civilian life the way he'd melted into jungle shadow. He worked, raised a family, drank with men who never asked questions that required long answers. Once, years later, someone pressed him. "Did you ever do anything big over there?" Jack thought about it. He thought about rockets that never fired again. About ambushes that never closed. About Americans who learned to stop announcing themselves. He shook his head. "No," he said, "just made it home." The paradox stayed alive long after the war ended. Young officers would study doctrine built on firepower, speed, dominance. They would underline words like overwhelm and shock. They would practice calling for support with clean voices and perfect grids. Then some of them, just a few, would remember stories that didn't quite fit. Stories where nothing happened. Stories where the absence of gunfire meant survival. Stories where victory sounded like insects returning. Those officers would hesitate just long enough one night. They would lower their voices. They would turn the radio off. They would choose not to fire. And because of that hesitation, men would live. Miller never forgot the morning after that first night. The single crater. The useless brass. The weight of realizing that strength without understanding was just noise. He carried that lesson into everything afterward. Work, marriage, arguments, parenthood. When his temper rose, he waited. When someone tried to provoke him, he listened instead. When the world demanded reaction, he asked whether reaction was what it wanted. His son once asked him, "Dad, were you scared in the war?" Miller thought of rockets, of darkness, of men bleeding quietly while the jungle watched. "Yes," he said, "but I learned when not to show it." "Who taught you that?" Miller smiled. "Someone who understood silence." The jungle, of course, never forgot. Forests remember patterns. They remember which animals announce themselves and which ones pass unseen. They remember who survives. In Phuoc Tuy, the trees grew back over shell holes. Roots twisted through rusted metal. Leaves covered footprints again and again, erasing evidence with patient indifference. But not lessons. Those remained. Noise still carried too far. Silence still bent outcomes. And somewhere, in that thick green space between light and shadow, the jungle still favored black panthers over shouting men. That was the absurd truth. That was the paradox. Power was not the ability to make the world react. Power was the discipline to let it reveal itself first. And in a war where sound could kill, the men who learned to be quiet didn't just survive the jungle. They earned its respect.